Malachi is presented as the last prophet of the Old Testament, delivering God's final message before 400 years of prophetic silence and forming a powerful bridge to the New Testament. Imagine living in a world where heaven seems quiet, where prayers feel unanswered, and where God's voice once spoken through prophets appears to have fallen silent. This was the moment Malachi stepped into history, not with thunder from the sky or dramatic miracles, but with words sharp enough to awaken a spiritually exhausted nation. The people of Israel had returned from exile, rebuilt the temple, and resumed their religious routines. On the surface, faith was still alive, but beneath it all, devotion had grown cold. Worship became mechanical. Promises were broken. Hope was fading. And into this uneasy silence, God sent one final messenger, Malachi, whose very name means my messenger. His task was not to entertain, but to confront, not to flatter, but to reveal the truth. Malachi spoke to priests who no longer honored God, to families struggling with faithfulness, and to a nation questioning whether God still cared. His message was both a warning and an invitation, a warning against empty religion, and an invitation to return to genuine faith. More than that, his words quietly pointed forward toward a future messenger, toward restoration, toward Ganrasisi, and toward the coming of the Messiah. This is not just an ancient story. It is a mirror. Malachi's voice still echoes today, asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. Are we truly devoted, or just going through the motions? Are we listening, or simply waiting for God to speak first? Before we journey deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy thoughtful Bible stories that bring history, meaning, and faith together, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves meaningful stories. Your support helps keep these timeless messages alive. Now, let us step into the final words before the silence and discover why Malachi still matters today. His ministry took place around 430 BC, at a time when the long journey home from Babylon was already fading into memory, and the promise of restoration no longer stirred the hearts of the people as it once had. The temple stood again in Jerusalem, its stones carefully set, its altar burning once more. Yet something essential was missing. The return from exile had brought physical freedom, but spiritual renewal had slowly given way to disappointment, routine, and quiet disillusionment. The people had expected glory to return overnight, but instead they found themselves living ordinary lives under foreign influence, struggling to reconcile God's promises with their daily reality. At first, hope had been strong. The songs of return were filled with gratitude, and the rebuilding of the temple felt like a new beginning. But years passed, and the enthusiasm waned. Worship continued, yet it became increasingly mechanical. Sacrifices were offered, but without reverence. Prayers were spoken, but without expectation. Faith turned into habit, and devotion into obligation. The people still believed in God, but many no longer trusted that He was actively involved in their lives. The priests, meant to be spiritual guides, reflected this decline. Instead of leading with integrity and devotion, many treated their sacred responsibilities casually. Offerings were accepted without care, rituals were performed without sincerity, and the line between reverence and convenience slowly disappeared. When leaders lose their sense of calling, the people soon follow, and this erosion of faith spread quietly through families and communities. What once had been a living relationship with God began to feel distant and formal. Moral compromise followed naturally. Marriage, intended to reflect faithfulness and covenant love, was increasingly treated as disposable. Commitments were broken when they became inconvenient, and personal desire often outweighed responsibility. At the same time, injustice took root. The vulnerable were overlooked, promises were bent, and self-interest quietly replaced compassion. None of this happened suddenly. It unfolded slowly, through small choices, unchallenged attitudes. 10 declask scene, and a growing sense that faith no longer required the heart, only outward participation. Perhaps most striking was the people's confusion when confronted. They did not see themselves as unfaithful. They asked honest questions, wondering how they had gone astray, unaware that distance from God rarely announces itself loudly. It usually arrives gradually, disguised as normal life. This spiritual blindness became the clearest sign of how far devotion had faded, not through rebellion, but through neglect. It was into this world that Malachi spoke, standing at the edge of history, looking both backward and forward. His voice emerged not during open rebellion, but during quiet complacency, when faith was still present but no longer alive. The weight of his message came from timing as much as content. He addressed a people who believed the story was over, who assumed the greatest moments with God were behind them. Yet his words carried an unmistakable urgency, reminding them that silence did not mean absence, and delay did not mean abandonment. Malachi's message flowed naturally from the tension of that moment, connecting the broken expectations of the past with the hope of what was still to come. He revealed that God had not withdrawn, even if his people felt forgotten, and that the long silence ahead was not an ending, but a pause before something greater. In this fragile season between promise and fulfillment, Malachi became the final voice, calling hearts back before history turned its page, preparing the way for a future that would change everything. Malachi confronted religious hypocrisy and empty worship at a moment when faith still had a structure, but no longer had a soul. The temple stood at the center of Jerusalem, its rituals continuing day after day, giving the appearance that devotion had survived the years of exile and return. Yet beneath the rhythm of ceremonies and spoken prayers, something had quietly eroded. Worship had become predictable, and predictability had slowly drained it of meaning. What once expressed love, gratitude, and awe had turned into routine, performed because it was expected, rather than because it was heartfelt. Malachi's message cut directly into this contradiction. He spoke to a people who believed they were honoring God, simply because they showed up, because the sacrifices were offered and the festivals observed. But he revealed a deeper truth. Presence alone was not the same as reverence. The offerings brought to the altar told a story the people themselves refused to see. They gave what cost them little, keeping what was valuable for themselves. And in doing so they revealed how lightly they regarded the one they claimed to worship. The problem was not the act of sacrifice, but the attitude behind it, a quiet belief that God would accept whatever was convenient. The priests, entrusted with guarding the sacred, stood at the heart of this decline. Their role was meant to shape the spiritual life of the nation, to teach discernment and lead by example. Instead, many had grown careless, treating holy responsibilities as routine tasks rather than a calling. By allowing compromised offerings and approaching worship without honor, they taught the people, without words, that devotion did not require the heart. Over time, this message settled deep into the culture, shaping a faith that looked alive but lacked depth. Malachi did not speak gently about this reality, because gentle words would not have broken through indifference. His confrontation was sharp not out of cruelty, but urgency. He exposed the gap between outward religion and inward devotion, forcing his listeners to face a difficult question. Was their worship shaped by love for God, or by habit and self-interest? The discomfort his words created was intentional, meant to awaken a conscience that had grown dull through repetition. What made Malachi's message especially powerful was that he did not present worship as an isolated act confined to the temple. He revealed that empty worship was a reflection of a deeper problem, a fractured relationship that affected every part of life. When reverence fades in worship, integrity soon fades elsewhere. The way people treated their commitments, their families, and one another mirrored the way they treated God. Half-hearted devotion at the altar echoed through broken trust and moral compromise beyond it. Yet even as Malachi confronted hypocrisy, his words carried an invitation beneath the warning. He was not calling for perfection, nor demanding elaborate rituals. He was calling for sincerity, for a return to worship shaped by honor rather than obligation. He reminded the people that God was not impressed by appearance, but attentive to the heart. Worship, as Malachi described it, was meant to be an expression of genuine relationship, not a transaction meant to satisfy expectations. In this way, Malachi's confrontation fits seamlessly into the larger story unfolding around him. A nation drifting through routine stood on the edge of silence, unaware that their final opportunity to listen had arrived. His voice became a mirror held up to a community that believed it was faithful, yet had forgotten what faithfulness truly meant. By challenging empty worship, Malachi was preparing the ground for something far greater than reform. He was pointing toward a future where devotion would no longer be measured by sacrifices alone, but by transformed hearts. As the final prophetic voice before centuries of silence, Malachi's challenge lingered in the air long after his words were spoken. His message refused to let worship remain shallow, insisting that if faith was to endure, it must be real. In confronting hypocrisy, he was not closing a chapter, but quietly shaping the expectations of what true devotion would one day look like. He addressed social and moral issues not as separate concerns from worship, but as clear evidence of what faith had become in everyday life. Malachi understood that devotion revealed at the altar would always be reflected in the streets, in the home, and in the way people treated one another. As ritual lost its meaning, relationships began to fracture, and the consequences of spiritual neglect quietly surfaced in the most ordinary parts of society. What appeared to be private choices were, in truth, symptoms of a deeper spiritual drift. Marriage stood at the center of this decline. What was meant to be a covenant built on faithfulness and trust was increasingly treated as something temporary, shaped by convenience rather than commitment. Promises once spoken with reverence were easily abandoned when circumstances changed. Malachi spoke into this reality with urgency, not simply to defend an institution, but to reveal how lightly people had begun to treat covenant itself. When faithfulness to one another eroded, it reflected a growing indifference toward faithfulness to God. The breaking of personal vows mirrored the breaking of spiritual trust, showing that devotion could not survive when commitment was optional. Beyond the household, injustice quietly took root. The vulnerable, those without influence or protection, were increasingly overlooked. Foreigners struggled without support, widows were ignored, and orphans were left without advocates. These were not dramatic acts of cruelty, but subtler forms of neglect that slowly reshaped the moral fabric of the community. Malachi exposed this indifference by reminding the people that genuine faith could never be separated from compassion. A society that claimed devotion to God while disregarding those in need had misunderstood the very heart of worship. The issue of tithing revealed another layer of this spiritual decline. What had once been an act of trust and gratitude became a burden people sought to avoid. Resources meant to support the work of the temple and the well-being of the community were quietly withheld, not out of poverty, but out of fear and self-preservation. This was not simply about material support. It was about trust. By holding back, the people revealed their uncertainty that God would provide, choosing security in what they could control rather than confidence in what had been promised. Malachi did not present these issues as isolated failures, but as connected threads in a single story. When faith became shallow, relationships weakened. When worship lost sincerity, justice lost urgency. Every neglected responsibility pointed back to a heart that had grown distant. Even while maintaining the appearance of belief, the people did not see themselves as unfaithful, and that was part of the problem. Their moral compromises felt reasonable, even normal, shaped by the pressures of daily life rather than open defiance. What gave Malachi's words such weight was his refusal to separate belief from behavior. He revealed that true faith was never confined to sacred spaces or specific moments, but expressed itself in loyalty, generosity, and care for others. The way people managed their households, their resources, and their responsibilities revealed more about their devotion than any ritual ever could. Faith that failed to shape daily life, Malachi insisted, was already fading, no matter how familiar the language of worship sounded. Yet even as he exposed these realities, Malachi's message was not without hope. His confrontation carried an underlying invitation, a reminder that renewal was still possible. The patterns of neglect he described had been learned over time, and they could be unlearned. Commitment could be restored, compassion renewed, and trust rebuilt. By addressing social and moral failures so directly, Malachi was calling his audience back to a faith that was alive, visible, and transformative. Consummate in weaving together worship, justice, and daily conduct, Malachi strengthened the bridge he was building between what faith had been and what it was meant to become. His words insisted that devotion could not survive as a private belief alone, but must shape how people lived, loved, and gave. In doing so, he prepared the ground for a future message that would carry this same truth even further, revealing that genuine faith always leaves its mark on everyday life, alongside judgment. Malachi proclaimed hope and restoration, ensuring that his message did not end in condemnation, but opened a path forward, after exposing empty worship, broken commitments, and neglected responsibility. He turned the attention of the people towards something they had almost forgotten, the possibility of return. His words revealed that correction was never God's final intention. Even in a season of decline and disappointment, the door to renewal remained open, waiting not for perfection, but for willingness. Malachi spoke to a people who believed distance from God had become permanent. Years of unmet expectations had shaped a quiet resignation, a sense that the best days of faith were behind them. Into that weariness, Malachi delivered a simple yet powerful invitation, calling them to turn back, not through grand gestures, but through a genuine change of heart. The promise was clear and deeply personal. If they returned, God would meet them in that movement. Restoration, he declared, was not earned through effort alone, but restored through relationship. This promise carried weight because it addressed fear as much as failure. The people had learned to protect themselves, holding tightly to what they could control, whether in worship, relationships, or resources. Malachi challenged this posture by revealing that trust, not caution, was the foundation of renewal. When the people withheld devotion or generosity, it reflected uncertainty about God's faithfulness. By inviting them to return fully, Malachi was calling them to rediscover confidence in a God who had not changed, even when their circumstances had. Purification stood at the heart of this hope. Malachi described a refining process, one that removed what was false without destroying what was valuable. This image spoke to a future beyond mere reform, pointing toward inner transformation rather than outward correction. The promise was not that life would become effortless, but that faith would become genuine. What had grown dull through routine could be reshaped, refined, and restored into something strong and enduring. Blessing followed naturally from this renewal, but not in the narrow sense of material gain alone. Malachi spoke of abundance as overflow, the result of alignment rather than reward. When trust replaced fear and devotion replaced habit, the outcome would touch every part of life. This blessing extended beyond individual comfort, shaping a community where generosity replaced scarcity and faith re-entered daily experience. Malachi made it clear that restoration was never meant to be private. It was meant to renew the collective life of the people. Perhaps the most powerful image of hope in Malachi's message was the promise of healing. After years of spiritual fatigue, The people needed more than instruction. They needed renewal at the deepest level. Malachi's language pointed toward a future where light would rise after darkness, bringing warmth and restoration to what had been wounded by neglect and disappointment. This promise reached beyond his own generation, carrying the weight of anticipation and expectation that would linger through centuries of silence. What made Malachi's hope so compelling was that it did not ignore reality. He did not deny the failures he had named, nor did he soften the consequences of complacency. Instead, he placed hope directly beside judgment, showing that correction and compassion were never in conflict. The same voice that confronted also invited, and the same message that warned also healed. This balance revealed the heart of God more clearly than either judgment or mercy alone ever could. As the final prophetic voice before a long silence, Malachi left his audience not with despair, but with anticipation. His call to return was not limited to his own time, but extended forward, shaping expectations for what restoration would ultimately look like. In pointing toward purification, blessing, and healing, he reminded the people that faith was not ending, but preparing for fulfillment. Even as history paused, hope remained active, waiting for the moment when restoration would be fully revealed. His prophecies point forward to the Messiah, lifting the story beyond correction and restoration and directing it toward fulfillment. As Malachi's voice fades from history, it does not leave behind silence without meaning, but silence filled with expectation. After confronting hypocrisy, calling for renewal, and promising restoration, he turns the eyes of his listeners toward the future, toward a moment when God's plan would be revealed in full clarity. His words become a horizon, not yet reached, but clearly visible. Malachi speaks of a coming messenger who would prepare the way, a figure who would awaken hearts, challenge complacency, and call people to repentance once more. Centuries later, this promise finds its fulfillment in John the Baptist, whose voice echoes Malachi's urgency as he calls people back to God and prepares the path for something far greater than himself. This connection confirms that Malachi's message was never meant to stand alone. It was the final thread woven into the fabric of the Old Testament, intentionally left unfinished, waiting to be completed. Beyond the messenger, Malachi points to an even greater hope, describing the rising of the Son of Righteousness, bringing healing and restoration. This powerful image speaks of light overcoming darkness, of renewal replacing weariness, and of life emerging where faith once felt cold and distant. For those who had grown tired of waiting, this promise carried reassurance that God's silence was not abandonment, but preparation. What had been spoken in fragments through prophets would one day be revealed fully in a person. In Christian understanding, this promise reaches its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. In him, the themes Malachi introduced find their completion. The call to sincere worship becomes a call to transformed hearts. The demand for justice and faithfulness finds its fullest expression in love and sacrifice. The promise of purification and healing becomes a lived reality, not only for a nation, but for all who seek renewal. What Malachi hinted at through prophecy, Jesus embodied through life, teaching, and grace. This is why Malachi's role is so unique. He stands at the threshold of two eras, looking back at centuries of covenant history while pointing forward to redemption yet to come. His words invite readers to live in that tension, holding on to faith even when fulfillment feels distant. The long silence that followed his ministry was not empty. It was filled with expectation, shaped by the promises he left behind. As this story comes to a close, Malachi reminds us that faith is never confined to one moment in history. His message continues to speak across time, calling people to sincerity, hope, and trust in a God whose plans unfold with purpose. Though his voice was the last of the Old Testament prophets, its echo leads directly into the opening pages of the New Testament, where promise becomes reality. Thank you for taking this journey through the story and message of Malachi. If you found this exploration meaningful and would like to continue discovering powerful stories from the Bible, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. Your support helps bring these timeless messages to life and share them with others who are searching for meaning, faith, and understanding.